In this gripping story, a routine airport security check turns into a dramatic confrontation when a white police officer singles out the narrator with a suspicious gaze. What the officer doesn't realize is that the narrator is the owner of the very airline they're flying on. As the situation escalates, the officer's arrogance quickly crumbles upon discovering the truth. Watch as the power dynamics shift and justice unfolds, culminating in a courtroom battle that challenges systemic prejudice. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. I had just cleared the security checkpoint at the airport and was making my way toward the check-in counter when I noticed a white police officer standing nearby. He seemed to be watching me with a level of scrutiny that felt both intrusive and familiar. His gaze lingered on me longer than it did on the other passengers, a look that I had unfortunately grown accustomed to over the years. It was a penetrating, judgmental stare that suggested he had already formed an opinion about me. Something about his demeanor gave me an uneasy feeling, as if he was preparing for an encounter that would not be pleasant. Each time I navigate airport security, there's a sense that my every move is under a microscope. I feel as though people are silently evaluating me, assessing my presence and actions with a critical eye. Today was no different. As I moved through the security area, I noticed the officer's attention fixated on me, his gaze unwavering and intensely observant. It was the sort of look that makes you feel like a specimen under a magnifying glass, a familiar and unwelcome experience for me. His stare felt predatory, as if he were sizing me up for some imagined infraction. Despite the discomfort, I remained composed. Years of dealing with similar situations had taught me to maintain my calm, even when the world seemed intent on throwing obstacles in my path. Yet, today felt different. There was an ominous sense that something was about to unfold, that this unsettling stare might ignite a series of events spiraling out of control. I had an unsettling premonition that this encounter would not be routine. I was on my way to Chicago for a business trip, an ordinary journey, part of my regular schedule. But as I stood there in the bustling airport, feeling the weight of the officer's gaze, it became clear that today's challenges would arise before I even boarded my flight. My heartbeat quickened slightly, although I maintained a calm exterior. I had an internal sense that this officer was not going to let me go easily. He seemed the type to act on preconceived notions, quick to judge based on appearances, and eager to find a threat where none existed. But he had yet to realize who he was dealing with. I wasn't just another passenger. I was the owner of the airline for the very flight he was scrutinizing. If he decided to make an issue of it, he would soon learn the truth, and I was prepared for his reaction. As I anticipated, the officer began to approach me, his eyes locked on mine. His face was impassive, but his gaze conveyed a steely determination. It was clear he had already made up his mind about me and had no intention of backing down. I recognized this type of authority figure, one who relished his position of power and was eager to flaunt it. He drew close without introducing himself, his demeanor brusque and unwelcoming. "Let me see your documents," he commanded, his tone carrying an unmistakable air of authority. I handed over my passport and ticket without a word, maintaining my composure despite my growing irritation. The surrounding crowd began to take notice, sensing that something unusual was transpiring. The officer scrutinized my documents with a growing intensity, his focus unwavering. "Where are you flying?" he demanded, his gaze still fixed on my papers. "To Chicago," I answered, doing my best to keep my voice steady and restrained. "And what's the purpose of your trip?" he continued, his tone growing colder and more interrogative. "A business trip," I responded with an even tone, trying to remain as composed as possible. He snapped my passport shut and spent a few more moments studying my face, evidently deep in thought as he contemplated his next move. It was clear that he was conflicted, uncertain yet still driven by the prejudices that shaped his actions. Finally, without a word, he seized my arm with a firm grip and began to guide me toward his police car. At that moment, I faced a critical juncture. I could have resisted and potentially escalated the situation, but I understood that such an action would likely make things worse. Instead, I chose to maintain my calm, even as the eyes of the surrounding passengers followed us with growing interest and curiosity. I held firm in my belief that this was the moment when he might come to recognize his mistake. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 1 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. As we arrived at the police car, I took a seat in the back, deliberately keeping my demeanor calm and composed. The officer, meanwhile, opened the driver's door and settled into the driver's seat with an air of confidence. His movements and expressions were marked by a self-assuredness that suggested he believed he had the situation completely under control. His face displayed the kind of certainty that comes from a person who feels untouchable, someone who assumes they know exactly how things will unfold. But it was time to challenge that illusion. As he prepared to drive off, I leaned forward, catching his gaze in the rearview mirror. "Do you want to know who I am?" I asked in a calm, measured voice. The officer's smirk was instantaneous, revealing his skepticism. He was likely expecting a feeble excuse or a desperate attempt to escape. "I am the owner of this airline," I stated with the same level of calm. The impact of my words was immediate and profound. The smirk on his face evaporated, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. For a split second, his eyes widened, and the shock was evident. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough to demonstrate that he had realized the gravity of his error. His previously unshakable confidence began to crumble before my eyes, like a fragile house of cards collapsing. The weight of the realization was visibly altering his demeanor. A heavy silence enveloped the car, thick with tension. He was now at a loss, unable to come up with an excuse or a way to rectify the situation. His prejudice had led him to this moment, but now all the power had shifted to me. In the back seat of the police car, I maintained my steady gaze through the rearview mirror. Although the officer's eyes were fixed straight ahead, I could detect subtle signs of unease, slight shifts in his posture, the tightness in his jaw, and his knuckles gripping the steering wheel with increasing intensity. He was avoiding looking at me, as if fearful that I would detect his growing doubts. Internally, I experienced a profound sense of calm. I was now in control of the situation. I could have revealed my true identity immediately, but I chose to let him sit in his uncertainty, allowing him to stew in the implications of his actions. I was aware that the moment would soon arrive when his world would unravel, when his arrogance and prejudice would be replaced by fear and realization. But for the time being, I allowed him to cling to his illusion of control. I reflected on past instances where similar situations had ended unfavorably for me, where people in positions of authority had used their power to belittle and undermine me. There had been times when I felt completely helpless and despondent, not knowing how to escape such scenarios. However, today was different. Today, I was no longer the person they were used to seeing, submissive and disempowered. Today, I held a position of latent authority, one that was not immediately visible behind my outward calm and silence. When the car finally came to a stop outside the police station, I felt the last remnants of my anxiety dissipate, replaced by a profound sense of calm and confidence. Everything was unfolding exactly as I had envisioned, and I could already foresee the sequence of events that would soon unfold for the officer in question. As the officer beside me opened the door and gestured for me to step out, I complied with outward calmness, making sure not to betray any hint of nervousness. We walked towards the station's entrance, and he led me inside with a silence that was growing increasingly awkward. Upon entering the building, I could sense the weight of other officers' scrutinizing stares. Their glances were laden with suspicion and judgment, a stark indication that they, like the officer escorting me, had preemptively judged me as merely another troublemaker. To them, I was a problem to be dealt with, a narrative they had already written in their minds. Little did they know how mistaken they were about me. I didn't feel the need to utter a single word. My lawyers were fully aware of the situation, and I had full confidence they would arrive precisely as planned. For me, this ordeal was more than a mere confrontation with prejudice. It was a deliberate test of my resolve to demonstrate to these individuals just how misguided their assumptions about me were. Seated in the small, austere room where they had brought me, I observed the officer across from me meticulously avoiding eye contact. His unease was palpable, evident in the way he hastened to complete the paperwork, glancing anxiously at the clock every few seconds. It was clear that he was eager to finish this matter quickly, yet he knew deep down that the situation was spiraling beyond his control. "How much longer?" I inquired, still seated with an air of calm. The officer looked up briefly but remained silent. His silence, however, spoke volumes. It was as if he hoped that everything would resolve itself in the way it usually did, that I would somehow fit the mold of the problematic individual he had anticipated. But I could sense his self-assurance waning, much like ice melting under a relentless sun. And this was only the beginning. As time progressed, the tension in the room intensified. The officer continued to avoid conversation, his nervousness becoming more pronounced with each passing minute. Then came the pivotal moment when I decided to assert myself. I straightened in my chair, allowing a slight, deliberate smile to cross my face. "My lawyers are already on their way," I stated, breaking the oppressive silence. The impact of my words was immediate, akin to a bolt of lightning. The officer's face drained of color, and for a fleeting instant, I saw a flash of fear in his eyes. He had just begun to grasp the gravity of the error he had made, though he had yet to fully comprehend the magnitude of the predicament he had found himself in. His hands shook slightly, and he quickly turned his gaze back to the paperwork, though it was clear his mind was no longer on the forms. This was the moment when the full extent of his downfall began to crystallize. He had assumed control, believing that everything was under his command. But now, with the looming realization of impending consequences, his confidence was disintegrating. The officer recognized that this was not merely a minor mistake, but a full-blown catastrophe that threatened to unravel his entire career. By this time, my lawyers were approaching the station. The officer's time of reckoning was drawing near. As he sat at his desk across from me, attempting to maintain a facade of control, I could see the tremor in his hands. Each incoming call on his radio seemed to heighten his anxiety. I remained silent, allowing him to fully grasp the severity of the situation and the potential collapse of his career that was swiftly approaching. I watched intently as he nervously shuffled through the papers on his desk, his eyes firmly fixed on the scattered documents rather than meeting mine. His actions were a clear sign of his anxiety, as if he was trying to find a way to make everything turn out as it always had before. In his mind, there was still a lingering hope that the situation would resolve in the usual manner, that his actions would be justified, that I would fade into obscurity as just another victim of his prejudices. But this time, things were different. This time, I was not the person he had anticipated I would be. His hands, previously steady, now betrayed him with their visible trembling. The facade of control he had once maintained so effortlessly was crumbling. He had navigated this situation countless times before, always confident that he would emerge unscathed. Yet today, he confronted a reality he hadn't prepared for. His standard tactics were failing him now. Instead of relishing his perceived power, he was left to wait for the judgment he could no longer control. The door creaked open, and my lawyer entered with an air of assured competence that immediately shifted the dynamic in the room. The officer's attempt to mask his apprehension was futile. His face momentarily lost its color, revealing his inner turmoil. My lawyer bypassed any formalities and addressed the issue directly. "Can you explain the reason for detaining my client?" His voice was calm, yet it carried an authoritative edge that cut through the officer's pretense. The officer hesitated, clearly flustered. I watched as he fumbled for an explanation, his usual rhetoric failing him. Every action he had taken, every question he had posed earlier, now seemed absurd and unjustifiable. The silence that followed was palpable, thickening the air with the weight of impending accountability. "I was following protocol," the officer finally stuttered, his voice lacking conviction. My lawyer, undeterred, pressed on without acknowledging the feeble excuse. "And are you aware that my client is the owner of the airline for the flight he was trying to board?" The impact of these words was immediate and devastating. The officer's demeanor shifted drastically. He froze, his face turning an unhealthy shade of gray. The realization of his grave error sank in. A mistake so monumental it jeopardized not only his professional standing but potentially his entire career. His hands shook uncontrollably, and his gaze darted around the room, unable to find a safe place to land. At that moment, the fear was almost tangible, palpable in the room. The officer's confidence had evaporated entirely, replaced by a stark, cold awareness of the consequences awaiting him. As my lawyer continued with his questions, the officer's composure disintegrated further. He quickly exited the room, his pace hurried and his steps faltering, clearly summoned to answer for his actions by his superiors. The gravity of his predicament was unmistakable. He faced a reckoning that no amount of excuses could mitigate. In the aftermath, my lawyer and I sat in the room, the silence between us pregnant with the weight of what had transpired. For me, this was more than just personal vindication. It was a triumph over a flawed system that had permitted individuals like him to exploit their authority without repercussions. As the minutes dragged on, the door opened once more, and the officer reappeared. His pallor deepened and his shoulders slumped in defeat. The self-assured air he once projected was now replaced by a visible collapse of his confidence. His voice wavered as he tried to explain his actions, his gaze fixed firmly away from mine. "I've been asked to provide a full explanation," he said, his voice trembling. The unraveling of his career was now evident, each step he had taken leading him to this undeniable moment of reckoning. Although he had yet to fully grasp the full extent of his mistake, it was clear that this was the end of his professional facade. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 2 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. As the officer departed, my lawyer and I remained in the stillness of the room, reflecting on the significance of the moment. It wasn't merely about my sense of justice being served. It was about confronting and dismantling a system that allowed for such abuses of power. The changes set in motion were profound, and the consequences for those who had misused their authority were now inevitable. The interrogation room was small and claustrophobic, its gray walls pressing in with an oppressive monotony. I sat at the narrow table, waiting for this farcical ordeal to conclude. Despite the circumstances, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. It was a feeling I had learned to cultivate over years of navigating similar situations, but today held a different significance. This time, I was on the other side of the equation. Today, I was not the one being wrongfully accused and humiliated. Today, I was determined to turn this incident into a lesson for others. I reflected on past experiences when prejudice seemed to follow me like a shadow. In those moments, I had felt powerless, unable to effectively defend myself against unjust accusations. Each of those experiences, however, had imparted valuable lessons, gradually building my resilience. Today was a stark contrast. I was no longer a passive victim. I was ready to stand up and make a statement. I was not merely seeking justice for myself. I was intent on demonstrating that such discriminatory actions would not go unchecked. My thoughts returned to the officer who had initially detained me. He believed he was in control, using his biases as a weapon against me. But he was gravely mistaken. His time was over. This situation had transcended personal grievance. It was now a matter of principle. I knew that, eventually, the scales of justice would tip in my favor, and those who had acted unjustly would face consequences. All I needed to do was wait. The passage of time was on my side. The door to the interrogation room swung open, and I was escorted into the police chief's office. The officer who had detained me was already seated there, his earlier bravado noticeably diminished. His face was taut with tension, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, betraying his unease. I took a seat across from him, observing his struggle to maintain composure. The police chief, a stern-looking man in his mid-50s with a commanding presence, sat behind a large wooden desk. He cast a critical glance at me, and then at his subordinate, the atmosphere in the room thick with tension. "So, what exactly happened here?" the chief asked in a cold, detached tone, his gaze shifting between the officer and the documents laid out before him. The officer began to stammer an explanation, but his words were disjointed and lacked conviction. He spoke vaguely about his suspicions and his sense of authority, but each explanation seemed more feeble than the last. His voice dwindled to a murmur, his eyes flickering around the room as if seeking an escape from the predicament he had created. My lawyer stood beside me, a steady presence who chose not to interrupt, allowing the officer to entangle himself further in his missteps. When the officer finally fell silent, the chief turned his attention back to me. "Your lawyer has informed us of your true identity, and I must say this situation is deeply troubling," the chief said, his voice edged with a sharpness that betrayed his recognition of the gravity of the matter. "We will address this issue promptly." The officer's gaze snapped to me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. The realization of the severity of his actions dawned on him. His career was now at risk, and it all stemmed from a single erroneous decision fueled by prejudice. As the meeting concluded, the officer was instructed to remain for further questioning while I departed the office with my lawyer. I couldn't resist a final glance back. The officer sat with his head bowed, his expression a mix of confusion and dread. He no longer exuded the confidence he had earlier displayed, now looking every bit the man whose authority had been exposed as nothing more than a facade. Watching him in that moment, I saw the carefully constructed barrier of his arrogance crumble. He was faced with the harsh reality of the consequences of his prejudices. In that instant, he understood that his career, his reputation, and his future had been jeopardized by a single act of biased judgment. The weight of this realization was palpable, and for him, this moment marked the end of an era, a stark reminder that unchecked prejudice can dismantle even the most steadfast of careers. For me, this trial was more than a mere legal battle. It was a pivotal moment of truth that underscored the urgent need to dismantle a system deeply entrenched in prejudice. As I sat in my office, contemplating the forthcoming trial, I knew that the legal arena was not just a place where facts were debated, but a battleground of ideals, where each side fought to protect its interests. The case had moved into the court, and with it came the inevitable self-defense of the flawed system that perpetuates injustice. My objective was clear: to not only seek justice for myself, but to establish a precedent that would challenge and reform the systemic biases that allowed such behavior to flourish. My lawyer was confident in our chances, citing the undeniable evidence and the clear nature of the situation. However, I was acutely aware that the courtroom was more than a venue for presenting facts. It was where ideals clashed, and the defense of entrenched biases was often fierce. The system that supports prejudice is resistant to change and would not concede easily. Yet, I felt prepared for the fight. For too long, individuals like me had endured injustice, with similar cases either ignored or suppressed. This time, however, I was determined to not only secure justice for myself, but to make a resounding statement that such prejudice and misconduct were unacceptable. The day before the trial, I revisited every detail of the incident, reflecting on how the officer had unwittingly jeopardized his career through his actions. Despite his attempts to rationalize his behavior, the courtroom would force him to confront the reality of his misconduct. On the day of the trial, I remained composed. As the officer sat across from me in the courtroom, his demeanor betrayed a mixture of stress and exhaustion. He still clung to the hope of justifying his actions, while his legal team constructed a defense based on procedural norms and speculations, trying to validate his conduct with formal regulations. However, I was confident that this strategy would not suffice. When the judge entered the courtroom, the proceedings commenced with arguments from both sides. My lawyer addressed the court with assuredness, laying out the facts with clarity. He articulated how the officer's actions were not merely an isolated incident, but a manifestation of a broader, flawed system that condoned such prejudice without consequence. I observed the officer's growing discomfort as he avoided making eye contact with me, his hands visibly shaking, and the confidence that once characterized his stance had dissipated. When it was his turn to present his defense, he stood up, attempting to argue that his actions were within legal bounds. Yet, his arguments fell flat, lacking the conviction that had accompanied his earlier behavior. In the face of undeniable truth, his justifications sounded hollow, reverberating like an empty echo in the courtroom. The judge listened attentively, but with a demeanor that suggested he had already concluded. The decisive moment came when my lawyer highlighted the fact that I was the owner of the airline from which the officer had barred me. This revelation was the final, damning point in our argument. The officer's biases and errors were now glaringly apparent to everyone present. The judge swiftly rendered his verdict, declaring the officer guilty of exceeding his authority and acting out of prejudice. As I sat in the courtroom, I witnessed the complete disintegration of the officer's world. His face drained of color and disbelief etched across his features. It was clear that the outcome was inevitable from the moment he allowed his prejudice to dictate his actions. But this victory was about far more than just my triumph. It represented a significant challenge to a system that had long permitted individuals like him to operate with impunity. This case wasn't merely about achieving a personal win. It served as a powerful message to everyone who had faced similar injustice that silence was no longer an option. As I left the courtroom, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment, knowing that we had begun to make an impact not just on one life, but on the broader system itself. This was merely the beginning. While I was aware that there was still a long road ahead, today's victory demonstrated that change was within reach if we continued to fight for it. After the court delivered its verdict, the pace of events accelerated dramatically. What had begun as a seemingly straightforward confrontation at the airport rapidly gained momentum, capturing the attention of media outlets across the country. My phone was incessantly ringing, inundated with calls from journalists eager to interview me. They were not just interested in the details of what had occurred, but were also eager to explore its broader implications for society. As I sat in my office, scrolling through the barrage of headlines and news feeds, I realized that my story had evolved into a symbol of the broader struggle against systemic discrimination and the destructive impact of prejudiced judgments. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 3 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. For me, this victory transcended personal achievement. I understood that this case would resonate not only with those who had directly experienced similar injustices, but also with those who might face them in the future. Each call from a journalist served as a reminder of my new role as a voice for those who could not defend themselves. This was not just about one isolated incident. It was about leveraging this story to ignite a broader movement for change. It was crucial to convey to the public that battling discrimination extended beyond individual encounters. It was a societal responsibility. As I prepared for the interviews, I focused on articulating not just the events of my case, but also the deep-seated issues of prejudice ingrained in society and the imperative to combat them. A few days later, signs of change began to manifest. News reports emerged indicating that police departments across the nation were reassessing their practices. What had happened to me had become a wake-up call, prompting both ordinary citizens and institutional leaders to reconsider their approaches. I watched a news segment reporting that a major city had initiated training programs aimed at addressing racial bias within its police force. Witnessing officers undergoing this training on screen, I felt a renewed sense of hope, recognizing that this was only the beginning of a broader transformation. The case had also sparked high-level discussions about police reform. Politicians began raising pertinent questions about the need for stricter oversight and more transparent interactions between law enforcement and the public. While this development was gratifying, I knew that a single case alone was not sufficient to overhaul the entire system. However, it represented a crucial first step in demonstrating that systemic change was indeed achievable. My lawyer reached out with news that we had been invited to speak at a human rights conference to share my experiences. This opportunity was a chance to further amplify the issue and advance the fight for justice. I recognized the importance of seizing this moment to continue advocating for meaningful reform and to ensure that the momentum for change persisted. A few weeks had elapsed since that transformative day, and I discovered that the officer responsible for my detention was no longer working at the police station. His career had been dismantled by a single decision rooted in his prejudices. The man who had once looked down on me with an air of arrogance and assumed his actions would go unchecked had now lost everything. As I contemplated this turn of events, I experienced a complex blend of emotions. It wasn't pure elation that I felt, but rather a deep sense of satisfaction that justice had been achieved. I recognized that his downfall was not merely the consequence of one isolated incident, but a powerful indictment of a broader system that had long permitted such abuses without consequence. This outcome represented a significant shift, a clear signal that times were changing and that actions driven by bias would no longer remain hidden or unpunished. Standing on the podium before an assembly of journalists and politicians at the conference, I was struck by the realization that my story was just one among many. Yet, this particular narrative had ignited a crucial dialogue that many had hesitated to start. I took the stage and spoke with earnest resolve about the importance of ensuring that such incidents never occur again. I highlighted the necessity of fighting against racial discrimination and advocated for a system that should be designed to protect individuals rather than devastate their lives. The world was evolving, and while this was a significant step forward, there was still a great deal of work to be done. I was ready to continue this fight. Each day offered a new chance to make a difference, and today felt especially momentous. Over the past few weeks, my life has undergone a profound transformation. What had started as a routine flight to Chicago had grown into a pivotal and far-reaching experience. Yet, it wasn't only my life that had changed. The officer's world had also collapsed. He was now left to rebuild his life from the ground up, stripped of the job and the sense of superiority that had once bolstered his authority. I didn't experience the kind of triumphant euphoria one might expect in such circumstances. I didn't see myself as a traditional victor. My satisfaction came from knowing that justice had been served and that the case had exposed long-standing issues within the system. The public now had a clearer view of these hidden injustices. That morning, as I awoke, my thoughts were awash with the memories of everything that had transpired. My daily life had resumed, and I had returned to my business, but each time I looked in the mirror, I was reminded of how drastically different this day might have been if I had not stood firm in my pursuit of truth. I knew I couldn't linger on these reflections for too long. An important day lay ahead, an opportunity to address the press and reiterate why this fight was so crucial. Upon arriving for the interview, I was met with a hero's reception. Flashing cameras and a barrage of questions from reporters greeted me even before I had fully exited the car. Inside, I felt as though I was on the brink of something momentous, though its full form had yet to be fully realized. I entered the studio and took my seat in front of the camera. The host greeted me with a warm smile and began the interview, saying, "You've become a symbol of the fight against racial discrimination. How do you feel now that your story has garnered such national attention?" I took a moment to gather my thoughts. How could I possibly encapsulate my feelings in a single response? I didn't view myself as a symbol. From the outset, my primary goal had been to seek justice. But now the situation has evolved into something much larger. For me, this was not merely a personal victory. My journey had started with the intention of illuminating a pervasive problem that had remained concealed for years. Everyone needs to consider how prejudice and stereotypes shape our actions and influence our lives. This wasn't just a story about one individual suffering due to another's mistake. It was a broader commentary on a system that enables such mistakes to persist. The host nodded in understanding, and we resumed our conversation. I took the opportunity to emphasize the critical importance of addressing discrimination not only through legal avenues, but also by influencing public awareness and consciousness. People need to recognize that prejudice inflicts profound harm on those who are targeted, but also deteriorates the integrity and character of those who perpetuate it. As the interview drew to a close, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The case had sparked a nationwide dialogue, marking the beginning of a significant shift. Yet, I was acutely aware that this was merely the start of a long and arduous journey. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 4 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Upon leaving the studio, my phone rang. It was my lawyer. He informed me that the police officer who had detained me had been officially terminated from his position and was in the process of clearing out his desk at the station. I felt a compelling need to witness this moment, not out of a desire for revenge or to bask in any form of victory, but because I needed to see it as a way to personally close this chapter of my life. Arriving at the station, I saw the officer, the man who had once wielded his authority with such arrogance, now meticulously packing his belongings into a plain cardboard box. His demeanor was one of exhaustion and defeat. At that moment, I understood that his life had irrevocably changed. He was once a man who believed in his unassailable authority, but now he was confronted with the harsh reality of the consequences of his actions. I observed him from a distance, choosing not to approach or engage in conversation. He was deeply engrossed in his thoughts and did not notice my presence. Perhaps that was for the best. He was now facing the truth he had long evaded and was beginning a new chapter in his life, one marked by accountability. This moment was the climax of not only his story but mine as well. We both emerged from this ordeal as transformed individuals. For him, it was a downfall, but for me, it represented a rise. This experience taught me that my struggle for justice was far from over. This was not just about our confrontation. It was about a broader narrative of justice and change. It was a testament to how speaking out against injustice can catalyze significant transformation. Thank you for joining me on this journey today. We navigated an intense exploration of prejudice and personal empowerment. We witnessed how a seemingly isolated incident of bias at an airport evolved into a profound lesson in confronting discrimination and asserting one's rights. We saw how individual prejudices can ripple outward, but also how such situations can serve as powerful catalysts for justice and systemic reform. This story exemplifies transformation, moving from a tense confrontation to a courtroom victory that not only restored personal dignity but also challenged and sought to amend the broader systemic issues. What have you learned from this story? How has it impacted your view on handling prejudice and injustice? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment below with one key lesson you've learned and how you plan to apply it in your own life. Your experiences and reflections are important and can help others navigate similar situations. If you enjoyed this video, please take a moment to leave your comment below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss out on our latest content. Your support helps us continue to bring these important stories and discussions to you.